I'm Francesca Rudkin, and welcome to another Rialto Channel podcast. I'm delighted today to be joined by David Stratton, film critic and lecturer, and for around 50 years, a champion of Australian film. David has directed the Sydney Film Festival, written for Variety, and for years hosted numerous popular television shows talking about film. And now he's the subject of his own movie. David, hello.
Hello, Francesca.
Now, you're more than happy to talk about film. How did you feel about being the subject of your own film?
Well, it was very different because I wasn't really in control of what was happening. I put myself in the hands of a very good New Zealand director, Sally Aitken, who I didn't know before we started this project. And I have to say that she didn't know, coming from New Zealand, she didn't know all that much about Australian cinema. So we had some long discussions about that, and I gave her a long list of films to watch, which she did, and we had a great relationship, and I think she did a terrific job. Did you offer any advice along the way, David? Oh yes, lots of advice. There were certain films that I really wanted to include, but then Sally came up with some ideas for films I hadn't thought of that she thought were really worth putting in. So it was a very collaborative relationship. I suppose I should, of course, mention the film was called David Stratton, A Cinematic Life, and it's got a really neat narrative. It's quite a unique narrative, isn't it? Because it's telling a personal story. It's telling us a little bit more about you. It's also, though, a wonderful look at Australian films that have had an impact on you, and also involved are some really fascinating discussions with filmmakers about their work. Have you sort of seen a documentary like this before? Maybe not quite like this. And again, I have to give all the credit to Sally, because it was Sally who sort of somehow detected links between my life and the films that I like, and which is something I'd never cottoned onto. So yes, I think it is an interesting combination of a survey of some of the most interesting Australian films, with many clips, of course, from the films, and lots of interviews and contributions from Australian directors and actors and cinematographers and so on. And at the same time, there's a sort of narrative there about my journey. So it is, I might have to say, quite fascinating. And when I discovered it at its most fascinating was when we were invited to show it at the Cannes Film Festival last year, which was a tremendous honour. We were in a section of the Cannes Film Festival called Cannes Classics, where they show films about the cinema, and it was wonderful to walk up the red carpet in Cannes. I found myself completely on the other side of the experience, because normally I've been a reviewer, not going up the red carpet, but going up the black carpet at the back, and this was a great experience. Which experience would you prefer? I think normally I'd rather be the critic that doesn't have to put on a tuxedo in the middle of the day and walk up the red carpet. But a lovely opportunity, lovely to be able to have that opportunity. It was great to do it once anyway. I wouldn't want to keep doing it. Now, I read somewhere that you have actually only seen the last sort of 10 minutes of this film, because you keep popping into Q&As and you get to see the last, sort of 10 minutes. Have you watched the entire film now? Yes, I have watched it now, and so it came out on DVD in Australia, and so I was able to sit down and watch it properly, and I must say, even though I'm in it, I enjoyed it. I'm sure you are sick of people asking if you've recommended it. I've certainly recommended it, yes, especially to my family, who didn't really know very much. My family over in England, they didn't know very much really about what I was doing in Australia. But it screened at the London Film Festival last October, and they were able to go to see it on a big screen in the middle of London, and so that was fun for them too. Well, that's wonderful, and I wondered if we could talk just a little bit more about that personal side of the film. Was it a bit of
cathartic exercise for you, sort of thinking about, where you're from and who you are and this extraordinary life that you've had, as you share your story with us in this film. There's very sort of personal moments there, especially to do with your family.
Yes. Again, I didn't really know. We didn't have a script for the documentary. We had an outline, so we knew more or less what was happening. But the scene where I really talk about my family and how difficult it was for them when I decided to stay in Australia and not return to England after coming to Australia for what was originally going to be just a couple of years, that was something that we hadn't really talked about doing. So it was all quite spontaneous and quite emotional, really.
And David, when you came to Australia, you became the director of the Sydney Film Festival. I think, were you about age 26, is that right?
That's exactly right, yes.
Now, that to me seems very young. That's quite an achievement.
Well, it probably wouldn't happen today, unfortunately, because I really think that some of these arts organisations would benefit from really young people coming in because they've got fresh ideas and fresh approach to this sort of thing. But look, it happened back then. It was, and I think it was something to do with the fact that Australia in the early 1960s was a lot less cosmopolitan really than it is now. And of course, films took a lot longer to get to Australia. It was probably the same in New Zealand, I'm sure it was. There was censorship was a big issue in Australia then, and there were all kinds of things. So here was I, having been living in London and having seen all the new films that might have taken probably a couple of years to get to cinemas in Australia, some of the smaller ones, the more specialised films. So I was seen as a sort of rather, I suppose, impressive character because I'd seen all these films that the rest of the people in Australia had only heard about, and I was able to talk about them and enthuse about them and so on and so on. So when the job of directing the Sydney Film Festival, which in those days was quite a small event, it was mainly based at the University of Sydney, and when the job of director came up, I was asked to do it. Now, the pay was miserable, I can tell you that. I was never going to make a fortune out of this. But I did seize the opportunity and thought to myself, well, this will, if we can turn the Sydney Film Festival into something really international and something really that people across the world want to send their films to, that would be quite an achievement. And I was lucky that almost exactly at the same time, the Australian film industry went into its period of renaissance with the early films of people like Peter Weir and Gillian Armstrong and Fred Skepsey and all the wonderful filmmakers who were part of the Australian New Wave. And so that happened at exactly the same time. So that was a very fortunate coincidence.
And David, you've spent years travelling to various film festivals around the world and being on juries and things. Are you still doing that now?
I'm still doing that now to a certain extent. Last September, I was invited to be on the international jury in Venice, and that was a very good experience. Annette Bening was the president of the jury, and it was great working with her. And we had an amazing lineup of films, like films that are on in cinemas now, like Three Billboards and The Shape of Water and films like that. So it was a wonderful lineup, and we had very difficult decisions to make, but it was all good.
If you think back to all those festivals and the juries and the time that you've had travelling, is there one in particular that is a standout for some reason? I don't know whether it was a controversy or just an incredible year of cinema, or
Well, I think that very quickly there were a couple. There was one when a very lovely Australian film called Samson and Delilah, made by a director called Warwick Thornton, won the Camera d'Or. That's the prize for the best first feature film in Cannes, and it was such a surprise and so exciting, and that was a wonderful moment. And I guess the other time is when the first time I interviewed Quentin Tarantino, when he was completely unknown, and he had made this film called Reservoir Dogs. and his publicist, they didn't even have the money to rent a hotel room to do the interviews in. So the publicist said, do you mind if we just squat on the beach to do the interview? And then I had a terrible experience because somehow I missed the film, and I never interview people I haven't seen the film. So I thought, what do I do, confess? So in the end, I asked some friends who had seen it, what questions would you ask? So they gave me some questions. But I needn't have worried because I asked the first question, and half an hour later, Quentin was still talking. So it was.
He left an impression.
Yeah, he knows. He's got a gift of the gab. Let's put it that way.
So going back to the films, the Australian films that you've included into your film, how did you go about choosing the films that you wanted to talk about?
It was very difficult because there were so many good films that we wanted to talk about, and of course, you've only got a limited amount of time; otherwise, the audience would get very bored. So we tried to pick some of the most interesting ones, films like Picnic at Hanging Rock, for example, of course, and some of those, Careful You Might Hear You, some of the really best Australian films. We had to leave out a lot, which was sad. We actually made 2 versions of this. There's also a 3-part television series as well as a cinema version, and we were able to pack a bit more into the television series.
Well, that makes a lot of sense because what I noticed when I'm watching this film was one I'm going, I want to go back and watch all these films again. And the second thing is I'm thinking, this film could be twice as long, because I started thinking, one film would make you think of another film and it's kind of like, this really should be a series, a homage to Australian cinema, a wonderful look at the history of Australian cinema.
Yeah, and that's what we really started out to do. We wanted to. Originally, it wasn't going to be so much about me. It was going to be more about just looking at Australian cinema and where it's come from, where it's going, what it's doing, and just reminding us of some of the best Australian films. And my thought all along was that if people watch this film and then think, oh, I'd love to see that film again, and maybe find it on streaming or somewhere and have another look at it, then we'll have achieved what we set out to achieve.
Such an incredible range of directors and actors come together in this film to talk to you and to talk about you. Were you humbled by that?
Look, it was wonderful because, in fact, there were a lot more who wanted to come and be part of it, and for various reasons we just couldn't get to them. Like, for example, people like Cate Blanchett, who was overseas. We didn't have the budget to go overseas. We managed to go to America and do a few interviews there, and a couple in London. But basically, we knew that there were a lot of people who heard about this film that we were making and came to us and said, oh, we'd love to be part of it, and we just couldn't do it because we just didn't have the budget.
It's said there aren't too many other people in the world who know as much about film as you do. I was curious, though, in the making of this film and talking to directors and actors about their films, are you still learning? Are there still revelations to you?
Oh, I think we learn something new every day, don't we? Isn't that what the cliche?
I hope so.
We do that? Yeah. Of course, yes. I'm learning all the time and rediscovering things. I mean, you see a film, and then maybe a year later or 2 years later, you see it again, and you find new things in it that you didn't notice the first time. Because the first time you're just experiencing the narrative and the story and maybe the performances. But when you go back and see it again, you know the story. So now you can watch for more of the details of how it was done and the steps that the director or the cinematographer or the writer went to give that effect that's so impressive or not impressive, as the case may be. So yes, I mean, every time I rewatch a good film, I find something new in it, and that's always exciting.
And I was interested too to hear an actor such as Sam Neill talk about how strongly he still feels about Evil Angels, a film that was released, I think, 1988 was it, and people's reaction to the line or comments. He was quite passionate about that. These roles can stick with actors.
Absolutely, and look, I think Evil Angels is a very good example because that was a film that polarized Australians at the time, just as the whole tragic case of Lindy Chamberlain and her missing baby polarized Australians. And the film, which was made by Fred Nepesi, brilliantly evokes what Australia was like, all walks of Australia, how they reacted to that story. And I know that Sam, who played Michael Chamberlain, was tremendously moved by the experience of making the film, and is still angry about what happened to the Chamberlains. And well, you know, Sam's a very sensitive person, and I'm not surprised that having played that role, he really identified with the trauma that the Chamberlains went through for such specious reasons.
So you've been regarded over the years as being a real cheerleader for Australian films. What is it about Australian films that grabs you? What is it you love about them? And is there something distinctive? Do you think that there's a common trait that sort of is threaded throughout Australian cinema?
No, I wouldn't say that. But I think that in general terms, it was great. It is great for Australians. And I think it's the same for New Zealanders too. When they watch New Zealand films, you're watching your own story. Most films are American or English, or most films we see in cinemas. So isn't it wonderful when you get a great New Zealand story like Hunt for the Wilder People coming to the screen, and you can recognize all those accents, and you can recognize those situations, and you empathize with it all so much more than you do when you're dished up sort of secondhand American culture. So it's the same with me in Australia. I just love seeing Australian characters speaking with Australian accents on the screen, Australian stories being told, and using Australian locations in our cities, in our outback, and so on and so on. And I must say, when I was director of the Sydney Film Festival, I wasn't only showing the new Australian films, I also was a bit of a champion of New Zealand cinema too. I came to New Zealand several times to select films, and we showed many of the great New Zealand films of the 70s and early 80s at the Sydney Film Festival.
And it's really wonderful when, you know, we might watch a Taika Waititi film, and then, you know, we sort of cross our fingers and send it out into the big wide world and hope that people will get our humour and get, you know. And it's really wonderful when they do, but you never quite know.
Yeah. And it doesn't always happen. I mean, there are some Australian films that I'm very, very fond of that don't make it outside because the humour, I mean, like The Castle, you know, the Americans just didn't understand The Castle, and it just doesn't work. Yes, again, it must be very much the same. I mean, you must have been thrilled that Hunt for the Wilder People was such a great international success.
Oh, most definitely. And, you know, The Castle, it's interesting you bring up The Castle, because I think this is probably, I don't imagine that you would change your mind very often, David, because you're such a considered critic and reviewer and things. But The Castle is one film that you do talk about in A Cinematic Life, about changing your opinion of.
Yes, I was not wildly impressed with The Castle the first time I saw it. I mean, it's a film made very modestly. It's not. I still would say it's not particularly well made as a piece of cinema, and I found I guess coming from England still, you know, even I've been in Australia for more than 50 years, I still don't always get the Australian sense of humour. And The Castle, of course, is a quintessential example of that very laid-back Australian sense of humour. And the first time I saw the film, I just didn't respond to it. And I found it a bit patronising, to be honest, towards the characters. And so I gave it a rather indifferent review. And then people started saying, "Oh, you're wrong about this. You're wrong about this. It's so good. It's so good." And it sort of got into the culture, really. And so I said, "Okay, well, I'll watch it again." So I watched it again, and in fact, I've now seen it a few times. And now I get it. And I'm really sorry I didn't get it the first time.
What I'd love to know, David, just very quickly, is sort of tell me a little bit about the state of the Australian film industry at present.
Well, it's like all these things. It comes and goes. We've had a big success with a beautiful film. I don't know if it's been shown in New Zealand, called Sweet Country, which is the new film by Warwick Thornton. It was premiered at the Venice Film Festival last September when I was on the jury, and I was very pleased that all the members of the jury, there were 9 of us, and everybody loved it, and it actually won the 3rd prize in Venice, and that's a really fine film. Sam Neill is in it too, with Brian Brown, but some really great Aboriginal actors, and if it hasn't come to New Zealand yet, do look out for it because it's wonderful.
It's on its way, yes.
It's on its way, good, and there's always exciting things that come along, and then there are disappointing things as well. You know, you can't expect to have great films all the time, but there are a lot of films being made here in Australia now, and many of them are really exciting, and some of them sort of fall through the cracks a bit. So it's hard to say exactly what the state is, but it's the main thing is that we have an Australian film industry, and that in itself, I think, is exciting.
Oh, well, look, thank you so much for talking to us today, talking to me today. I could talk to you all day about movies. It's wonderful. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Okay, bye-bye.